Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to QI Connect, our first session of 2023. I'm Ruth Glassborough, Director of Improvement at Healthcare Improvement Scotland, and I'm your QI Connect chair for today. So QI Connect brings together colleagues across health, social care and beyond to learn together from international leaders in the fields of improvement, innovation and integration. So I'm delighted to welcome everybody who's joining us either live today or through listening and watching to it after the event. Part of the reason why we're able to get such excellent speakers is because of the number of participants who do join and watch and take time out to support us. So thank you for playing your part. I am going to hand over now to Michael, who is going to take you through some housekeeping notes.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And our frequent flyers will have heard this time and time again, but just in case anyone new is on the call, just some housekeeping notes. So please use the Q&A function to submit your questions for our speaker today. More on that just in a minute or two. A reminder that the session will be recorded, and by taking part, you consent to this. In the event of any technical issues on our end, please bear with us and we'll work to bring the session back at the earliest opportunity. And also a recording of the session and any resources will be made available following the session today. And you'll find those on our website. So just about the Q&A function, you will see at the top right hand of your screen, the Q&A icon. Please submit your questions using the Q&A icon there. We do need to moderate the questions just to ensure that we're not duplicating question themes. So bear with us. Once you submit those questions, those will be moderated and they will show up in the featured questions once for a chance to do that. And remember that you can like your favourite questions to upvote those and help our chair identify the most popular questions for our speaker. Thank you very much, and back to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Michael. So last year we had nearly 3,500 participants join our sessions from 27 different countries. And since QI Connect started, we've had engagement from approximately 1,300 organisations, including 89 universities and colleges. And live streaming events like this is very much a team effort, and we're very lucky to have such a professional and capable team of individuals supporting QI Connect. So just a quick call out to the team behind the scenes. Thank you. And thanks also to the NHS Scotland National Video Conferencing Service, who continue to provide us with excellent support for these events. So please do remember to tweet as you learn and use the QI Connect hashtag and tag in our Connect. And if you're not already following us, then please do give us a follow. So I am delighted today to introduce our guest speaker, Steven Shorrock, who, like all of our speakers, has given of his time freely in recognition that the audience today is largely staff working across health and care services. So I had everything crossed today, hoping that this would be our third time lucky, as some of you may remember that we had to postpone our first attempt due to a COVID wave and the associated pressures attached to that. And then we also had to postpone the second attempt as it fell in the official mourning period for our late Queen. So I can't tell you, Steve, how grateful we are that you stuck with us and giving us your valuable insights and experience that are so relevant to many of the issues that we're facing right now. I've had a sneak peek at your slides and we are in for a real treat today. So Steve describes himself as an interdisciplinary humanistic systems and design practitioner with a main interest in human and system behaviour in the context of safety-related organisations. His experience includes working with aviation, healthcare and government administration, as well as working across academia and both internal and external consultancy. So he brings a wealth of knowledge to the table today. Amongst his many accolades, he is a chartered ergonomist and human factors specialist and a chartered psychologist, along with being the adjunct Associate Professor at the University of the Sunshine Coast, which I understand is one of the best universities in Australia. And he's an honorary clinical tutor at the University of Edinburgh. He has also apparently recently acquired a love of brown noise, which I had to Google to see what it was. And according to his daughter, he is also an expert in saying all the right Generation Z phrases at all the wrong times. So watch out for that today in his presentation. So without any further ado, Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Ruth. And anyone that knows me from Twitter will know that my daughter is the main act there. That's where all the wisdom comes from. But today I'm going to talk about work from a variety of different perspectives. I'm just going to share my slides first of all because it might be a bit more interesting with something else to look at. So, hoping now that you can all see those, and I think that hopefully you can. This is what we're going to be talking about today. So understanding and improving the reality of human work. While I'm a human factors and safety specialist, mostly what I'm interested in is work, ordinary day-to-day work, as well as when things sometimes go wrong and sometimes go particularly well. But some hopes for this session for today. So first of all, to provide some accessible and applicable ideas for you about work, and secondly, to help inspire curiosity and learning about work. Now, I'm going to talk about a lot of things. Some of you will have heard of many of them before, some of you will have heard of some of them, and some of you will have heard of none of them. And I'm not going to assume any prior knowledge, and I try to explain things in a way that makes sense generally to everyone, and that's my acid test really. I want to start with this idea that normal work can bring all kinds of different outcomes. You can see now on the screen this kind of normal distribution, and this could be a normal distribution of any kind of outcomes on any kind of measure in any industry, healthcare, aviation or otherwise. It's a kind of theoretical standard distribution. And what you can see on the left there in red is accidents and incidents, which are a small percentage of outcomes. They're obvious internal to an organisation, such as the NHS, obvious externally as well, because an accident has happened, or an incident, a near miss, and sometimes they're obvious externally, sometimes reported in the media and be investigated in depth, and there are often legal requirements to do so. That line that you can see on the left there could be anywhere. So for aviation, for instance, we'd be pushing that very far to the left, in fact, off the graph. For healthcare, it would be pushed a little bit more to the right in terms of the percentage of outcomes that might be classed as an accident. In the middle, we have normal, routine, day-to-day performance, normal outcomes, an average day, an unremarkable day, not very well understood and generally ignored, which is why we don't understand them very well. We don't tend to pay attention to things that are normal, everyday work, normal, everyday outcomes. And then we have exceptional performance, which is obvious internally, hard to see externally, usually because things just go normally from the client's point of view, from the patient's point of view, from the passenger's point of view, and things are gratefully accepted. What they don't see behind the scenes is the exceptional performance that's had to be done to create those outcomes. This side of the graph is a little bit more difficult because there's no line between exceptional performance and routine normal performance. The line that I would say is when you go home and you see your partner, your children, your parents, whoever, it's the kind of day that you probably want to talk about because something quite exceptional has happened. Maybe things have gone exceptionally well, maybe you've saved the day. Now, what I want to show here is why we need to pay attention to this green part in the middle. If you can see there, what's happening is the normal operating point is shifting to the left. That means we're operating closer to the safety margin, closer to this kind of boundary where there might be an accident or incident. Now that's obvious when you look at the green portion, but if you just look at that red portion, you can see that red dotted line has increased only marginally, because this shift in the normal operating point is not well recognized in terms of accident reports or incident reports. They're perhaps not very sensitive to it, but it's certainly coming. And so you might see a kind of wave of problems. And so as I said, we tend to ignore that portion, but then the question is what keeps the system safe for most of the time, because most of the time we do not have accidents and incidents. And we need to ask the question why that is. And there are very good reasons for that. And one reason that I usually explain is, imagine there are going to be cuts in your organization, and inevitably there are and will be. What if the thing that's being cut, if the efficiency gain that's being made is cutting the thing that keeps the system safe most of the time? And that's why one reason why we need to pay attention to it. Now, this normal operating point could shift in the other direction. You might find some hospitals, some units, some wards that operate in a really exceptional way, where you might say that's really good practice that you can learn from. Again, if you don't pay attention to the day-to-day, then you don't see this example of high quality work, high quality processes. I wrote a blog article on this is my blog, Humanistic Systems, so you could just Google this after the session, getting a handle on 3 zones of performance. So this graph makes it look like accidents and exceptional performance are very far apart, distant in time and in place. In fact, what can happen is that exceptional performance can be just around the corner from accidents and incidents, or it could be that an accident is happening in one part of an organization, but exceptional performance is happening also or somewhere else in order to recover from or mitigate that accident. It can also be that we see ourselves performing exceptionally, perhaps extremely productively, but we're actually taking ourselves to the edge of this accident zone. Now I want to just move on to some of the realities of work as done before I talk about really learning from work as done and understanding it. So what are some of these realities? Well, the first looks obvious, is that people work within complex systems, complex socio-technical systems. What does that mean? It means that there are various forms of complexity. So in any hospital, in a paramedic environment, in a lab testing environment, for instance, you have lots of technological complexity, lots of social complexity, lots of complexity in the structure of the organization, and lots of complexity in the processes. You add all of that together, you've got a very complex system. Why that's relevant is because a complex system, when we compare it to something like, let's say, a car engine, which we might call a complicated system, that complex system of an organization, let's say, if we see it as a complex system, is impossible to take apart into pieces. It's impossible to measure in terms of all of the precise parts of it. It's impossible to fully understand it. It's impossible to quantify everything. It's impossible to predict it. And there's no central control that there might be in a mechanical system, like an aircraft where you can make controls to the engines, for instance, control inputs. We don't have that in an organization. Now, these complex systems are intrinsically and inescapably hazardous. So there are many hazards both in the healthcare system and in my industry, in the aviation system. Some of these hazards are designed, and some of them are natural. And again, these hazards are also impossible fully to understand, fully to predict, and fully to control. And therefore, we build in lots of defenses in order to protect us from the hazards. In doing so, we build in more complexity once again. These complex systems also run in degraded mode of operation. What does that mean? Well, it means that the system does not run as was originally intended. It was not even designed as it was intended, and it does not even operate as it was designed. Lots of changes have been made along the way. Staffing certainly isn't what it should be. There are more procedures than was ever imagined. The equipment doesn't work, and there's lots of different types of equipment that doesn't work as expected. Somehow it all works. And there are multiple interacting and competing goals related to efficiency, to safety, increasingly to security, and all sorts of other all sorts of other goals that compete with each other. Now, for practitioners, these goals tend to boil down to goals relating to production and goals relating to protection or safety. We often say safety first, and we say things like zero harm, but the everyday pressure is on production. The everyday messages are about production and producing more, doing more with less, better, faster, cheaper. Now, to do this, we make trade-offs, compromises, and adjustments in order to get the work done. And these occur at all levels, from frontline operation, whether you're a nurse, a doctor, a surgeon, or going all the way up to CEO level, going to regulatory level, going to government level, judiciary level. Doesn't matter who you talk to, they're all making trade-offs all of the time. Now, the sixth thing I want to say that could seem quite appalling is that all interventions that we make based on these trade-offs are gambles. And that's because these interventions take place in multiple different contexts. And these contexts are all variable, they're all uncertain, and these uncertainties multiply to mean that the environment is very complex and very uncertainty, and we never quite know what's going to be the result of this medication that's prescribed, for instance, or this surgery that's performed. We know in most cases what will tend to happen, but we don't know in any specific case what will happen. Also important to say that people do things that make sense to them at the time, given the context of work. This is what we call the local rationality principle, which means that people do things that are rational to them in their local context, given their expectations, their focus of attention, they know, and so on. So that's true for anyone, and you can't really think of exceptions to that when you think of decisions you made. They all made sense at the time that you made them. When you look back, maybe not so. Number 8 is that we have built-in limitations. So we have limitations of memory, of attention, of judgment, of decision making. We have physical limitations. And logically, we all perform below our average on any measure 50% of the time. So there's variation in our performance. As I mentioned, this performance is influenced by multiple different contexts. Legal context, regulatory context, judicial context at the kind of top, and then more locally we have our, let's say, technological context, the temporal or time-based context, the informational context, procedural context, and so on. We don't see these contexts as separate like that, but there are many things that are separate but also interrelated with each other. And finally, what I want to say about the reality of work before moving on is that for all of these reasons, real work is rarely as we imagine it to be. So our imagination of other people's work is always inaccurate, it's always incomplete. Imagination of our own future work is always usually inaccurate, and so on. But this work is imagined, how other people imagine we should work, how we imagine we might work, that becomes part of reality. Because it becomes often part of the designed environment of work. Some of those points there are covered in this paper here called How Complex Systems Fail. And if you want to understand complexity and safety, this article by the late friend of mine, Richard Cook, who was an anesthesiologist and safety scientist, this is the one that you really want to read. These are the 3 or 4 pages that you want to read. I'm going to turn now to just this idea of work as imagined, work as done, which you can see here depicted as two circles. So there's an overlap between what other people think that we do and what we really do, but there's also big areas that are not the case. There's areas where people imagine things that are not true at all, and there's areas where we do things that people just don't imagine. So if you were just to think about this, I don't need you to write the answer, but just think about what it is about your work that others outside of your profession might find surprising, but that might be interesting or relevant to them. I sometimes do this exercise with postcards, just blank postcards. Give it a try with your colleagues if you have a workshop. It's a good exercise, and you just write on that postcard on the back the answer to this question, and then you give that to somebody else. And you find out all sorts of interesting things about other people's work that's relevant to you, but that somehow is quite surprising to you. I've asked this sort of question to many different groups, from clinicians to pilots, air traffic controllers, members of the judiciary, and had many examples, so I'll just give a couple. So for instance, this example is about preparing intravenous injections, where in order to save time, a kind of batch of injections would be prepared at once in order to be delivered over time, whereas the rule would say that it should be drawn immediately before use. But this was done simply because of the demands of the context, the time demands or the temporal demands and the number of patients and so on. Another example was radiology request forms. What the procedure would say is that these should be completed and signed by the person who is making the request, which, for instance, might be the surgeon. But the surgeon may be scrubbed and sterile, and so it might then be the anaesthetist that would be completing the form and signing off the form, which would be quite surprising, perhaps to a head of radiology. Another example is never events, and what was described to me here is that the intention of this was actually really good, to focus on a small number of events that really shouldn't happen because there are adequate safeguards in place. What really happened, though, is that this list grew and grew and grew, and the term never event had unwanted connotations and had unintended consequences in terms of how they were perceived, in terms of, well, if you have one, then you've done something really bad, and perhaps in terms of reporting. Another example is paperless discharge process. And I'm sure you're very familiar with these, and we have all sorts of paperless systems ourselves. The intention being, obviously, to remove the paper, to make it more efficient, and the result being that the bits of the system did not really coordinate. So the test results, for instance, could not be distributed, and so people would go back to the old system of bits of paper. This section now of the presentation, I want to go on to, well, how do we actually understand these realities then of work as done? I'm just going to present 5 for the sake of 5 things that might be easy to remember and to do. So the first of those is to be curious about others' work. So that sounds straightforward, but quite often there's a lack of that curiosity in organisations about the work of people quite different to ourselves, who are the experts in their own work. But we often have most to learn from those that we interact with the least. Now, this is a virtual like webinar, but imagine if you were all in a room right now, you would probably walk into the room and you would probably be sat next to someone who's a colleague or know very well, i.e. the person that you probably have the least to learn from. So somehow we have to find those people that we have the most to learn from and whose work is relevant to ours. One thing that we can try to do is to start by finding out what's working well and then move on to what makes the work more difficult than it needs to be. And there's a good reason for that sequence, that we often start conversations by looking at problems. and you can spend all day talking about problems, but very often things are working well that you need to keep, protect, strengthen, extend and build on. The second thing I want to say is to keep in mind what kind of work that you're thinking about. So work as done, I've mentioned earlier, is everyday work, and that's the real thing. It's the only real kind of work. It's actual activity, and it can never be fully understood. So all of the other kinds of work that you can see here are what I call proxies for the real thing. So you have work as imagined, which I've described already. There's also work as prescribed. That's the rules, the procedures, the guidelines. It's the policies, the regulations, even laws in some cases. There's also work as disclosed. So we have the things that we do, the things that people think we do, the things that we should do, and then the things that we say that we do, either in verbal or in written form. We also have work as analysed. So when you're investigating an incident or an accident, for instance, or when you're developing a new procedure, you'll tend to take work into its constituent parts. There's also work as observed. So if you've, during your own training, for instance, I imagine you observed other clinicians, other pharmacists, other nurses, other doctors, other surgeons. What you can see there is not work as done, the things that you can see from work as done. You can't see what's going on in the head, for instance. You can't see the judgments. You can't see what's going on in memory. So it's not the same as work as done. And then we have work as simulated, which is getting closer to the real thing. The environment is very different. You know that, for instance, nobody can die. You know that you can't be hurt. And so that's quite a different environment. In simulation, some of the important and interesting contextual issues are also neutralized or controlled, or they're not simulated. This work is instructed, which is the things we're told that we should do in training, which isn't necessarily what we go on to do. And this work is measured, which is those very small number of things that represent your work that can be measured. And then finally, there's work as judged, which is about the evaluations and judgments that are made about your work, often combining these other proxies. So combining these proxies can help to approach an understanding of work as done, recognizing that you'll never fully understand work as done. It's been and gone. It happened. Whatever I said 5 minutes ago has happened. It can never fully be understood from all different perspectives. We can only approach an understanding by combining these proxies. The third is to assume goodwill and make it easy for people to say what's on their mind. So here we're looking at the overlap between work as done and work as disclosed. And talking about everyday work means disclosing, in fact, the messy reality, going back to some of these realities of human work even that I talked about earlier, some of the things that we don't always like to talk about. Now, fear of consequences drives almost all, I should say, deliberate non-disclosure. So where we don't like to talk about work, even the everyday, what we do every day at work, is because we fear the consequences typically. It may also be because we can't really recognize how we do things. It's kind of automatic. But when it's deliberate, it tends to be associated with fear. The third thing is to create these relationships and have an environment where people feel safe to be open and honest. So some people call that psychological safety. But what environment does it take where people can tell the truth about their work, and how can you help create that environment? The fourth of the 5 tips is to get multiple perspectives. So different people have different insights into work. They see different problems, different solutions, and so on. So it stands to reason then that work as disclosed, when you're asking people about their work, you're doing some kind of interviews, discussions, workshops, then you need to do enough of these to get various different perspectives on work, because you'll know that the answer you get might depend on the person that you're actually talking to. Similarly, if you're observing someone at work, you're going to have to observe quite a variety of times and people and contexts. A night shift versus a day shift can be very, very different, for instance. And then the fifth one is to consider the multiple influences on performance. All performance has multiple influences because there are many different contexts. And what you can see on the screen, there are many different ones. They could be any really though, but societal context through COVID, that's quite obvious how that's influenced our day-to-day work. The social and cultural contexts, the personal influences in terms of perhaps our well-being, what we've got on our plate, our family life, our personal life. Political, legal, regulatory, that influences our work. The economic situation, well, that influences all sorts of work decisions as well. The organisational activity, policies, procedures, those influence work. The temporal context, or simply the time pressures, for instance, influence work. And then we have the physical, environmental, the technological, the informational. So whenever we're looking at performance and we want to understand it, we want to be looking at these kinds of influences and how these might affect the performance of people. Now, this is attributed to James Reason some years ago, who said, you can't change the human condition, but you can change the conditions that people work under. So that's where we should be looking to make changes. You can now put this together to kind of look something like this. So we've got work as done, activity. We have proxies for work as done, work as imagined, work as prescribed, and so on. And then we have these various influences on work. Now, these influences, what's interesting here is not only do they influence the work as done, the activity, what you actually do as a nurse, as a radiographer, whoever you are, they also influence these proxies. So they influence what people imagine that you do. They influence the work as prescribed, the procedures, the policies. They influence the measurements, for instance, the work as measured. So you can start to draw some lines between those to look at the influences. And these are four particular varieties that I started off looking at that are quite useful to look at how they intersect. So you can look at 1, 2, or 3 of these, or 4 of these proxies, up to 4 like this, and to start to look at where the gaps might be. You can also look at it in this way, so you can use these proxies to say, okay, how does work as imagined then affect, for instance, work as measured? And then how does what we measure influence what we do? And how does what we measure influence what we say that we do? And what's the overlap between those two things now? So there's all sorts of interesting things you can do by looking at these proxies and looking at either how they overlap or how they influence each other, or both. I want to finish in this last part now by 5 tips on improving the reality of work. And I thought the first of these that stands out as important to me is about relationships, to invest in diverse relationships and focus more attention at the interfaces. So all change, no matter how complicated, no matter how technical, happen through this conduit of the relationship. Most opportunities can be found also in the interfaces between groups, whether they're professions or departments and so on. That's what I've found over my kind of 25-year career so far. Where we tend to focus is within the group. Where we should focus much more is the interfaces between the groups. Again, whether they are occupational groups, departments, locations, it really doesn't matter. That's where the improvement is to be found, typically, mostly. And changes like this happen by collaborating with people most different to yourself, and that might feel the most difficult. Useful to start with what's strong This is what we tend to take for granted. But I find it useful now to start improvement conversations by talking about what's strong and not what's wrong. So to start with that, so it's a matter of sequence. It's not saying do appreciative inquiry and only talk about what's going well. It's saying start by looking at what you've already got in the cupboard before you go to the supermarket. Ask yourselves, what is it that you do well? What is it that you've got that you appreciate? What is it that you're proud of? What is it that you wish you'd done earlier? What is it that you'd recommend to your younger self or to somebody else? That you should defend and perhaps extend. So as an example, an absurd one, imagine a book on playing championship golf by learning the secrets of the worst 20 players in the world. That's sort of what we sometimes do in the safety world. We think that we can learn everything that we need to learn by looking only at the worst examples. Third out of these 5 tips is to choose the right mode of change. So sometimes change is done to people and we never appreciate that. Change is very often done for people, or at least that's what's imagined. But change should be done with and by people, and we should be starting again with those modes of change before we go up to the change for and the change to. And also to choose the right means and timing of change. So the right intervention depends on the situation. Is it a training intervention? Is it a design intervention? Is it a process or policy or procedural intervention? Well, that depends. For instance, there's no point in training 1,000 staff how to use a poorly designed system. The better mode of change there and the better means of change would be to change the system itself rather than to keep repeating this training. But there will be trade-offs, there will be compromises always in the solution that's chosen and its timing, and there will tend to be unintended consequences, unplanned adaptations that were never foreseen, which has implications for continued monitoring. To finally make it easy for things to go right, and it should be hard for things to go wrong, and it should be very hard for things to go very wrong. So in any kind of intervention, this is quite a good motto to keep in mind. And in the work that I do with the judiciary, for instance, it's something I try to emphasize when looking at any particular case involving a person. Was it easy for things to go very wrong for that person? If it was, then you've really got to look quite widely about why it was easy for things to go wrong when it should have been easy for things to go right. So as a sort of process that might be useful coming towards the end now for designing work as done, which might be a procedure or policy, this is something that might work for you. So to start by understanding work as done, how people actually work now in the context of work. Again, you can combine proxies, so you can observe people, work as observed, you can talk to them, work as disclosed, you can simulate work. Collaborate then on work as imagined. How do you imagine work could be done in the future? And then co-design prototype work as prescribed. Exactly how might we do this? And then implement incrementally in small stages in work as done. And then test work as imagined and work as prescribed against work as done. Remembering that what's being tested is what you imagine and how you imagine people will do the work, not the people doing the work and how they're doing the work. And then repeat this until the gaps between these 3 kinds of work as imagined, work as prescribed, and work as done, are acceptable. And as I said in the last slide, to continue to monitor that for any unplanned adaptations, unintended consequences, and so on. Useful also to remember behaviour.com. It's not a website, it's actually the COM-B model by Michi and her colleagues, that if you want to influence behaviour, then that's going to mean that people need to be capable of doing the behaviour, they need to be motivated to do the behaviour, and they have to have the opportunity to do the behaviour. Quite often when a behaviour that you imagine is not happening, one or more of these factors are not really being supported. And there are a few things to be aware of. And I'm aware coming to the end of the session now, but some foes of intervention, haste, so trying to fix problems quickly after an incident by hastily making some kind of top-down solution, overreacting, therefore making everybody's work more difficult via some kind of policy or constraint or restriction, focusing on components such as individuals, over-proceduralizing, scapegoating, setting performance targets, never zero thinking, so thinking that things should never happen, and campaigns. These are the things in my experience are things that tend not to work very well, even if they seem to work well in the beginning. And that's it, really. Just a reminder that all of our imaginations are incomplete, and to be kind of humble about that, to bear that in mind. And if you want to read more, there's my blog, Humanistic Systems. If you really want to get into human factors as a practitioner, there's a book there that I co-edited with my friend Claire Williams, and this Hindsight magazine, which I edit, which covers many, or in fact all of these topics. That I think takes me to time, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have from the floor.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was fantastic, and I can personally recommend the blog. There are some fantastic reads there. So we're going to turn first of all to our guest questioner, Julie Coombs, who's the Deputy Director of Improvement Networks at NHS Select. So Julie, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. I really enjoyed that, and I'm going to take home, make it easy for things to go right. Absolutely. My question is that we often talk about work as done in the context of clinical activity, but is there work in this area regarding management executive work, and what does it highlight?
There's actually quite some work, not nearly as much, but there's quite some there's some ethnographic work on what managers do. But as you would know, it very much depends on the person, because managers' work is much less standardized than, let's say, the work of an anaesthetist, which is not actually all that standardized, but it's even much less so. If I refer to my own work with managers, directors, CEOs across around 15 countries in Europe in aviation, in air traffic control, air traffic management generally, what I would say is that the things that I've said apply equally to managers. So managers have limitations, as we all do. Managers work in a complex and degraded system. They work with limited resources, with multiple pressures, and have to make lots of compromises, lots of trade-offs. The difference is they happen over a much longer period than, let's say, a frontline clinician. And so the feedback is quite different, because the feedback from your interventions, which are also gambles as a manager, the feedback, there's a huge lag. And so, of course, you don't know what the result of this policy decision is going to be. The feedback is not only delayed, there are many barriers, as you will know as managers, to getting that feedback, because as information is coming back to you, there are lots of filters. So that's what I would say. There are many constraints. They're just all of a different nature and a different time scale, but the work is essentially affected by the same, let's say, laws or principles.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for that. And it relates to a question, actually, that I'm going to jump to in the question box from Alison Leary, who is asking about how we can help embed human factors and humanistic workforce planning in NHS leadership and policy? So you've talked there about the importance, but how it's more difficult to do. Any thoughts about how we could help, though, to embed it in?
There's really two ways to, if I talk about embedding human factors. One is that you actually employ people who are already skilled, but there are not actually that many, so that's a problem. And the other is that people within healthcare actually train up to do these kind of jobs. The problem is there are very few jobs available. I've talked about this at length, and I know Alison, and she'll know that I talk about this, but if we compare, for instance, the NHS, the number of people doing full-time human factors stroke ergonomics work is no more than 10. That's about 1 in a million. If we compare to NATS, used to be called National Air Traffic Services, which made it more obvious what it was. But if we compare NATS in the UK, the number is around 30 for a staff of, I think it's between 4,000 and 5,000, the size of some hospitals. So that's the challenge. All I can hope, in the absence of any big recruitment drive, because the people are not there, is that people within the NHS start to become curious, start to train. That doesn't mean necessarily doing a master degree. It might mean doing enough for what they want to do. Commissioning is one example where you need more competency in that. So it's just to hope that more people pick up the books, do some study to increase the competency from within. The other thing that I would say about that is that one of the problems with us human factors people, is we tend to be quite technical, often a bit nerdy, and we don't often push ourselves to the ranks of senior management. There are a few examples. So the former director of safety and NATS was Gretchen Burrett, who was a formidable force of nature and human factors person. She was one. She went up to the Civil Aviation Authority as well. There was and there are other examples, but not so many. And so when we look at big institutions or the overarching umbrella institutions, NHS England as an example, where are the human factors specialists? So if you don't have them in the policy level, you're probably not going to get them elsewhere.
Really interesting, thank you. And to everybody who is attending today, please do keep adding your questions in and voting on the ones that are there. I will be guided by the ones that have the most votes, so I do use chair's prerogative sometimes to dip in and take one with lesser votes. But we have a pre-submitted question that I want to just pull out now, which is highlighting that given that human factors presents in so many elements of healthcare, where would you suggest starting, and what approach would you take to applying these principles to have the greatest impact? So the million-dollar question, Steve, where should we start, and how do we make sure we get greatest impact?
You should probably start by having human factors specialists as high as possible in kind of policy level, really, because you can obviously have human factors people. Let's say you employ somebody in a hospital, then that's fine, but they're going to be completely unsupported and on their own and overwhelmed, and probably will also be paid better elsewhere and so on. So it's not an easy place to start. So I have done work, for instance, with the International Civil Aviation Organization. So that's the big umbrella group when it comes to aviation. Now, once you get human factors requirements, standards, and so on integrated at that level, then they have to filter down. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of one approach. But the other is just that if you're interested in human factors, then look at how is this applying to your role and your colleagues. So human factors in nursing, human factors in the operating theatre, and so on, and just start to undertake some courses in that to see what it is that you can do.
Great, thank you. Great advice there. So you referred in your presentation to the importance of the workplace culture and psychological safety. And Audrey Fleming is again raising a question about this. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about the importance of workplace culture and psychological safety within a team context.
It's a really interesting one, and there's lots of hot potatoes, I think, here. One of the interesting things is that when I mentioned that most deliberate non-disclosure is associated with fear, and actually, who do we fear the most at work? What we will tend to say, okay, so the normal answer that's appropriate is think managers, you know, investigators. It could be prosecutors. It could be the media, the public. None of those, in my view, are the honest answer. The honest answer is we fear our colleagues the most. So we have to somehow start with how can we create an environment among colleagues where we can speak freely and tell the truth and extend from there. So start there. But then, of course, anybody else interacting with any other group, whether you're a manager or anything else, you have to ask yourself, what does it take for me to be able to hear the truth without putting somebody off saying it? So the answer is, what is it going to take to allow us to be honest? And we all have a role to play in that, within our teams, between our teams, hierarchically, inter-organisationally, and so on.
Great, thank you. And staying on this theme of some of the influencing contextual factors, you mentioned campaigns as a foe. So what would you recommend for public health campaigns then, i.e. weight control? It's a question from Anonymous.
Yeah, it's a great question, perhaps not to the right person. I just know that in a safety context, campaigns tend not to work and tend not to be very effective. There is some interesting research on messages where fear is used, for instance, and it might be useful for kind of one-shot behaviors where somebody needs to get something done once, but they tend not to be have persistent effectiveness over time. But I can't talk about public health because I'm not a specialist in that, and I can't talk about things like weight. I just know from a safety point of view that safety campaigns tend to have a short-term effect at best. What you're trying to do via that campaign is to change lots of people's behavior. As I presented on that ComB, or behaviour.com as I call it slide there, is that behavior is influenced by those, you know, three things. Are you actually capable physically and psychologically? Do you have the opportunity for that behavior? And are you motivated? And we make lots of assumptions about which one of those it actually is. For instance, we might say, oh, well, people are just not motivated to do the behavior. They're not motivated to lose weight, whatever, do sport. Well, maybe it's something else, like the opportunity, you know, the access to, you know, food or whatever, or maybe it's something like the, you know, the capability and actual, you know, to do this. So yeah.
It really helps us to start asking a few more questions and make some less assumptions here about the reasons behind it. Thank you. So Angela Carrington is asking, what do you think is needed for human factors and QI to become more integrated, with human factor principles and tools applied more to improvement programs?
Just building relationships between, you know, between two groups, but also both, you know, whatever you're a specialist in, don't be interdisciplinary and learn from multiple different ways of doing the same thing, which is trying to improve the work. Possibly one of the differences is the focusing human factors on understanding how the work is done. Lots of time is spent on that before you go about the improvement. So it's like, you know, the PDSA, the Plan, Do, Study, Act, the PDCA. I think people sometimes forget that that's it for the intervention stage. There's a whole lot of understanding that needs to be done before you do that stuff, or else you end up with unintended consequences. That's where some of the human factors methods might help. And again, they come down to fairly simple things, lots of methods for observing people at work, for instance, lots of methods for listening to people, lots of methods for sometimes measuring their responses, psychophysiological responses sometimes, and lots of methods for analysing and representing all of those data.
Great. So there's lots of practical tools and techniques we can use in the diagnostic element of QI work and in the designing better processes element of it.
Yeah, and on the design element, for instance, a standard kind of tool would be the ISO human-centered design life cycle, where we start off again by looking at the context, looking at the users, looking at their activities and tools, then go to understanding what it is that they need, and from that how those needs can be met, then producing prototypes, then evaluating the prototypes, and that's a cycle that keeps continuing depending on the results of that evaluation. So that's a kind of standard method in human factors that, again, by combining some of these things, you can do useful things.
Steve, unfortunately, that's us for time. That has just been another fantastic session. Thank you. And you've just stimulated, I think, so much thinking, so many questions. I know a number of us will be going off to look at this topic further, and hopefully you'll also see a sudden surge in your blog readership as well. So thank you so much for that today. And as I said at the beginning, for bearing with us and still doing this for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth, and thanks to all for joining and for organising.
Thank you. So just to highlight our speakers for next time in February, we have Nicola Burgess, Brian Jones and Sue Jenkins joining on us. It's going to be another fantastic session. Some of you may already be aware of the evaluation work they've done around the work that took place in NHS England around building a culture of continuous improvement culture with input from the Virginia Mason Institute. There are some really interesting lessons learned from that that's highly applicable to wider work across the UK around building cultures of continuous improvement. So heavily recommend joining us for that session. And of course, our back catalogue is available for you to watch and enjoy on our website. Or you can also visit us on the QI Connect YouTube channel. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and hopefully we will see you in February.